thank you all for coming. It's kind of a nice moment to be talking here. I've never actually been here before, but as some of you might know, this is actually the original Whitney Museum. So, yes. And so in that light, I was thinking about this talk with respect to Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney and her intentions with the original Whitney salon, which is the way it was originally conceived, as a means to encourage dialogue between artists and, in her case, collectors, but also other interested parties, I suppose one could say, where the distinctions at that time were really definitive and very much slanted towards a more European gesture. So in any case, it was actually formed as a way to support voices and thoughts and approaches that were not necessarily in this sort of mainstream approval, so to speak, and obviously has become something else in the intervening years since then. But the Whitney Museum itself was actually founded on her collection that was developed through everything that happened in this building. So it's kind of a nice, it's not directly related to the talk, but it was one of the reasons that I wanted to participate in this great program. And to that end as well, I also want to encourage folks to be responsive to what I want to talk about. It's really something, it's a general set of ideas that have come up over the course of my biennial research, essentially. I can't, because I'm not going to be talking specifically about biennial artists, as we have a confidentiality policy still in place at this time. This is really more a project that came out of observations and other types of thematic interests that seemed very resonant in the hundreds of studio visits that I was doing around the country and various other countries as well. And it's a very open topic, as you'll see. It really touches on a lot of different types of things, and I'd love to hear the ways in which, for those of you who are artists, it might be germane to your work or not, and in other ways in which it's located kind of in a larger cultural sense. It's not purely an art, purely a manifestation art, but really something I want to talk about with respect to image and meaning in the broader context of contemporary culture. So that's kind of a mouthful, so I'm going to start by being a little bit more specific. What I'm going to talk about today, or what I'm going to be showing you, is actually walking you through a recent book project, an artist's book project that I was invited to be a part of as to curate one of the books within the series that she created. And the theme of this series of books is the idea of was the impossible, and it was posed to me just as that, purely as a topic from which I could go in any direction I wanted and define it, you know, to whatever end that seemed most relevant to me. So it was actually kind of a perfect proposition at the time, given the hundreds, as I mentioned, of visits that I was doing at the time and trying to make sense of those, and a certain kind of impossibility of how one can read across that much work or that much content and so on. And it actually had me started thinking about both literally a notion of the impossibility of trying to speak to the larger world about what's going on in contemporary art, and that's a sort of biennial specific issue. But then it was also concurrent with a lot of work that I was seeing that was dealing with this notion of translation. And when I say translation, I actually mean it both in the more understood sense, and that is, say, transferring something from one meaning into another, from one set of symbols or language into another, but also the alternate definition for the word translation, which, because I'm kind of a dictionary dork, I actually have here. But outside of the science, there's three. There's one meaning translating the way you think of in terms of language to language. There's another that means a transformation of coordinates, which is actually a literal movement within space, translating position. And that's important with respect to the topic overall, a notion of literal physical translation, motion, movement, transit, as well as translation through, meaning turning something into another format that's with the intent to convey the same meaning. And then there's a scientific definition that's irrelevant to this topic, so we'll not do that one. So in any case, that's where the title of this talk, title of the book, came about. And God, I'm sorry, I'm the one who forgot to turn off my cell phone. It's embarrassing. So the idea with the book was to come up with a position or a proposition on the impossible and bring in other artists or whatever, writers, critics, to then respond to that topic. And as mentioned, the topic that I chose was the impossibility of translation. And I was thinking about it myself, both in terms of image translation as meaning conveyance, and then more literally the ways in which we turn one's words into other words, into other languages and other types of vehicles. And to make more of that, more to the point of the area in which I'm looking, the area that I was hoping for these artists to respond to, in other words, a kind of a liminal space between those two positions. I was thinking about the first time I really recognized that as a significant issue in how you understand meaning and things that are important in different types of art, whether it be, again, literature or visual art or so on and so forth. Are most of you familiar with the author Jorge Luis Borges? An Argentinian author, is kind of considered to some degree, well, the father of many types of literary formats now, kind of fractured rhizomatic narrative and various and sundry cyberpunk novels, the whole genre that most people credit to him, and as well as a sort of recurrence of different types of iconographic images, the labyrinth, the library, mirrors, infinity, such and such. I see a lot of you nodding, so I'm assuming you're familiar with it. But in any case, he was a very important author to me when I was younger, actually, and there was a particular story called The Writing of the God, or The God's Script, depending on the translation, that the ending of which was very meaningful in particular. And I actually was going to read to you the version that was important to me to make the point that is going to be relevant, hopefully, to all the rest of this work. So bear with me while I try to read aloud. Let the mystery writ upon the jaguars die with me. He who has glimpsed the universe, he who has glimpsed the burning designs of the universe, can have no thought for a man. For a man's trivial joys or calamities, though he be himself that man. He was that man who no longer matters to him. What does he care about the fate of that other man? What does he care about the other man's nation, when now he is no one? That is why I do not speak the formula. That is why, lying in darkness, I allow the days to forget me. So this was the first translation that I had read, and the story itself was the idea of the unspeakable script, the unspeakable language, was important to me, but I always felt like the ending kind of like it just kind of fell apart to me in a certain way. The phrasing of the last sentence, which for him is almost always a sort of cumulative moment he works up towards, just kind of the format that Borges tended to use. And then several years later, I read the translation that he didn't approve of, which to my mind was actually the real meaning of the text, and I'm going to read to you the difference, which is really the last two lines. What is the life of that other to him, the nation of that other to him, if he now is no one? This is why I do not pronounce the formula, why lying here in the darkness I let the days obliterate me. And the two major differences are the word speak the formula or pronounce the formula, and then I let the days forget me and I let the days obliterate me. I know it sounds like small distinctions, but I'm belaboring the point to try to pull out how significant I actually think those distinctions are and how much they shift meaning in language as well as in visual culture. The slight slippages of combination of image and text, or these kind of transferences of one word to another, that can entirely shift, to my mind, what the fundamental structure is of the text, if you use the image that way, if you use the idea of the image that way, or the story. And the idea of letting the days forget me versus letting the days obliterate me, to me, is a entirely different construct. So I'm mentioning that because that's what got me started on selecting the artists for this book that we then did. And what I'm going to show you is actually the book, the project. And some of them are pretty text heavy, so we're not going to go through them all. But it's more to give you a sort of flavor of the type of work that I'm talking about and what I mean with respect to these kind of slippages between language, and what is the difference between the meaning that Borges had in his mind, in his language, in that text that he preferred, which is another odd thing, and this one that was so much more meaningful to me, and that to my mind was his voice, which it isn't or can't be in translation in a certain way. So you end up like hitting a kind of paradox of all types of communication, right? That in any meaning conveyed is going to be inadequate, but is still necessarily the only communication that we can have. So that to me is sort of like a fundamental aspect of what art is trying to do, or what art does. And there's a lot of work that I've been seeing recently is very specifically attuned to this issue. Why that is, we can talk about a little bit later, because I have an opinion on that too. But in any case, so this is the name of the overall project. This is the artist who organized it. She's Spanish, Madrid-based artist.
Is this published already?
It is not yet published. This is actually, you'll be the first to see it. Do you mind if you turn one of those little ones on back here so that I can see some of my notes? Is there another one? Yeah. Can everyone see if we keep... Oh, do I have a light here? Even better. I'm not a big fan of podiums, I must say. Thank you.
Does that work well enough?
I think that'll do. If I need more, I'll ask. So what the format of the book, again, is this is the overall overarching project. So there's 6 books, as you might guess, 6 people curating each individual one. And I invited 10 artists to contribute to either some transformation of extant work or a new project. And so there's a combination thereof. And initially I had thought about, I had intended to, so this is the list, so those of you can check it out who know some of these folks. Initially, I had intended to then intersperse my text, my own commentary, what I normally do in a curatorial voice, as a kind of analysis or a way of communicating it, or a conduit, hopefully, of kind of meaning what the artist wants and what a viewer might not necessarily be able to access immediately, or give some other points of view to enlighten, etc., etc. You know, the point of curatorial text. And it started to feel to me really specious to be interpreting work that is about the idea of the impossibility of translating it. And so what I chose to do instead was actually, in certain cases, very purely factually tell you what the project is, because you wouldn't, in the cases in which it really would be entirely opaque. And then in other cases, I selected text, original text quotes that pertained in relatively oblique ways in most cases to the project itself, to kind of trouble some of that sort of straight narrative translation idea of what a curatorial voice is supposed to be doing. It's, to my mind, a pretty complicated endeavor that most of us, including myself, often get partially wrong. And again, the attempt is, I mean, it's the paradox of the attempt, obviously, because you don't want to be, if, you know, art is a framework of questioning to some degree, to my mind. It's an idea of openness or a network of ideas and again, questions. Then for me to then tell you, ostensibly be telling you what it's about, is obviously antithetical to that position. And yet, how do you do work in the process, work in the interim space of translating without defining both ends of the spectrum there? So anyway, so that's what the format is. That's what you're going to be seeing. And again, like I said, some of them are going to be more legible immediately like this, and some of them you're just going to get a flavor of what's going on with that artist's work. This is obviously Tauba Auerbach, San Francisco-based artist, whose work very directly deals with language translation, in other words, movement from, and this is again where you'll see some of this idea of literal movement, as well as how one meaning turns into another. And her project, each artist is about 10 pages, so you'll have to watch it through. So you'll see the way it moves on both the text side and the design side, and I'm just going to walk through it. This is interspersed, so keep in mind, we tried to do it as facing pages to give you a better sense, and the image just didn't read. So each pattern is faces off against the text, and this will be pretty clear. Hold on, I'm just going to walk you through it. So watch how they change, and this is what this project is. I'm not going too fast for you to see it, but was that clear? to everyone, the transition that's happening? So I don't know if you've ever played that word game of how you move from one text to one word to another by changing one letter at a time. And she's done, this is kind of an endeavor that she's used as kind of a conceit of many of her translation projects. So coming from the first word of a novel to the last word of a novel, and to the central word of a novel to the end of a novel, something like that. Things of that nature to kind of bring out some of these oppositional meanings that are embedded in each other by very small, slight shifts. The pattern pieces that are paired with them also do a similar thing in a kind of more mathematical way. It's like an algorithmic translation throughout that is more of us intended to read as a kind of like subliminal recognition of that movement. So when you're flipping through the book, you are reading the transition as well as kind of seeing it in a more subconscious way in terms of the visual patterning. And her another work of hers, which inspired to some degree the quote that I then applied to her project, was a film based, or rather a video based on the game Post Office, again often using these sort of very commonly understood word games or language games to make a point about these ideas of shift and the interim space in which things change. So I don't know, did you all play Post Office when you were younger? Where one person whispers a word to the next person who then whispers it, or a phrase, either one, and then it's the last. It's just comparing the first and last and how the degree to which they tend to shift over those incremental processes of change. And she did a series of them, would take like a well-known quote, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, or something like that, and film it as like a circle of her friends. Like 20 of them in a park in San Francisco, and you would just watch them whisper to each other, and there was subtitles of what was actually being said, so you could track that shift, and then the only other thing spoken was the last phrase. So I was thinking about this as an idea of the point of relay, of like that translation is actually a node of movement and kind of more of an idea of a networked constellation than it is about a literal one-to-one matching. It's not analog, it's kind of in a weird way far more of a digital structure. And the text actually came from a situationist text from the 60s that was about this idea of the postcard, which they were matching against a very similar idea of points of relay and points of indication, and how the postcard itself is not really about what is written on it or its meaning or its image, but the fact of it indicating motion and locating a specific point in time that then implies movement. So the quote was, from the deconstructive point of view, the essence of the postal is not that letters arrive, the functionalist view, but that they sometimes fail to arrive. In terms of distance spacing rather than destiny, the post is nothing but a little fold, a relay to mark that there's never anything but relays. And it again, I think, feels very resonant with this idea of the unstable shift, that this definition of one thing to the next doesn't actually pertain in most of what we do, or most of what we look at. Justin's project is going to be a lot harder, so I'm just going to be very quick about that one because it's very text heavy. And in general, what he's looking at is the idea of sign and architecture in contemporary culture, whether it be logos or architectural plans, and that those are kind of signifiers for other types of meaning. And he's footnoted them with these sort of elaborate explanations, and is kind of playing off the idea of the footnote as the extended translation of whatever the initial image or initial phrase is. So I'm going to, like I said, this is just a very difficult one to be legible to you, but just to you can get a feel for some of what a lot of these projects are about. Again, employing language in what appear to be pretty standard ways, or employing formats that utilize language in standard ways, but then trying to trouble that by creating a disjunct between the image itself, or what the image is intended to convey, and the way in which it's explained in this very factual tone. So again, unfortunately, you can't really read it as well as I was hoping you might be able to, but it's pulling from a lot of different historical discourses where image seems to translate one to the next or have relationship to the next, where in fact they don't, and he's pairing them to make part of that point, and then constructing relationships, some of which are real, some of which are historical, and some of which are entirely invented. Let's see if there's one that I can explain to you better. And this is kind of one that you might find familiar, and this is maybe one of the more literal ways of thinking about text and image translation. I'm sure many of you get these emails that are from solicitation groups or from corporations, or probably not actual or not factual gestures towards financial gain and things like that. You won this contest or engage in this investment or that kind of thing. And do people get these all the time, or is this just like a thing that happens in offices? In any case, one of the things they do, as you know, the spam filters have gotten a lot more sophisticated, so they have to develop increasingly complex ways to get past them. And one of the ways they do is by interspersing the real information, which is usually disingenuous anyway, but with this kind of babble. Basically, it's just like computer-generated babble, and then coloring it or structuring it on the page such that it reads as an image by the spam filter. So it's kind of a fantastic conflation, like in the real world, of a lot of these ideas of how you bypass readability in order to communicate the fact that it is in itself not based in a real thing, and that it employs an image as a means to ostensibly imply legitimacy or meaning, and then is in fact undermined by its own falseness, I guess, basically. But anyway, that's what the image is on the left there. So that just to give you an example of the types of things that were happening in this space. This being a wonderful thing that I just really want to tell you about, because it's I had no idea that does anyone shop at Home Depot ever? It's not really a New York thing, it's really much more an LA thing. But most of the artists there spend a lot of time there and become really familiar with a lot of the products and the particular companies that are promoted there. And this is this company, this logo, is actually one of their largest suppliers of all different types of things, and apparently I've just discovered, the only one in the country who makes this joint compound that they sell there. In any case, they also happen to be like an extreme Christian right organization, and so they put psalms and various and sundry other quotations on the bottom of every box of every product that they sell, that then gets deployed out into the world as construction material, which I think is kind of an amazing relationship to this proselytizing simultaneously. So that's kind of, that's not so much what he's talking about there, because he does tell that story, but I also think it's fascinating, so I wanted to put that out there as a way of conveying meaning via a vehicle you wouldn't expect. Okay, I'm going to get past his. This is a wonderful one, quite to the point. And, okay. Walead Beshty, also these two in a row are going to be a little bit difficult. Again, like I said, a lot of these are text heavy, so I'm going to try to explain them in general. A photographer primarily, although he really treats photography again as the idea of a history of how image constructs, the idea of how an image constructs history, or how that becomes iconic and static, and an iconic static translation of an event or a type, rather than a notion of temporal process, or things changing or indicating an evolution of an idea or an event or so on. And he does that both literally in the content, but then he also addresses it within the medium of photography itself. And has a sort of parallel practice wherein he creates kind of what are essentially photograms. They're what he calls his crumple photos, where he's using the photographic material as both image and support, and actually creates these kind of topographical shapes that are then placed directly, exposed directly, and achieve different kind of colors on different faces and different kinds of, again, like I said, topography that becomes a flattened image. So there's a lot of play between this idea of moving between medium and moving literally in transit as well. And what he did was actually, and again, these are matched up together, so you'll have the text with the image like that. He did a kind of diary of a recent art-based trip, like 4 exhibitions / residencies that he had, moving from Germany to France to upstate New York and then back to LA. And mapping in the text primarily the differences in watching television and the translated television episodes that he was watching over and over, how they actually functioned in terms of conveying meaning. Both, so I think in Germany the one was the German version of Cops, basically, and kind of remarking on how that communicates a certain notion of power, hierarchy, or so on, and what their attempt was in shifting that format, the American format, into a German version where it became very much about sort of social monitoring as opposed to like aggressive injunctions over lower socioeconomic levels. But in any case, and then in France, a similar program, but that led him to another that was kind of their version of reality TV, I guess, or a kind of ed TV scenario where you would just, it was played, it's totally brilliant, it's incredibly meta. It would happen in the morning at like 8 o'clock, and it would be a real-time view of various different professionals getting ready to go to work that you would watch while you would get ready to go to work. And it was like intensely boring, but really kind of amazing, because you get incredibly invested in these sort of conflations of time and space to somebody's unbelievably banal life that was similarly mapping your own process anyway. So throughout he's talking about this, and it's a very colloquial kind of journalistic or diaristic rather approach, as you can see by the way it's played out, and then he's laying them against images of both his space and movement as well as the actual photography. This is like when his photographs got ruined by the X-ray machine, and so that became kind of the embedded transit of this whole experience. That what the image before was the photo scanner or whatever, the drum scanner, I can't remember which one, that he managed to have access to at this on this college campus, because the photo manager guy, who he also put in there, was inclined to not do the student's work, so Walead did it for him in order to have access to that machine. So that becomes the image of the machine making the image, right? And then again, skipping back and forth, these are these crumple photographs I was talking about. So you see the kind of like, it becomes like a residue of its own material as well as its own process as well as its own translatability. So a density of a lot of different ideas that are in this whole notion of translation. I realize that this is a very large topic in sense of approach, and that's kind of the point of why I wanted to talk about it, because I think it is sort of like a really critical node of the way people are approaching making work right now, but because it has such complexity inherent to the idea of not being able to have an analog one-to-one, or indexical rather, relationship between meaning and text and image, and these artists kind of looking for where that sort of liminal space is, the in-betweenness of these processes and gaps inherently makes it messy, basically, which is part of the point of the way that I approach this book, and not structuring it, like giving structure that then kind of falls apart within itself for what you're expecting. Anyhow, so to that end, most of the artists really responded on that same level of opacity. A couple more of these. Let's see. Monica's project is perhaps coming from an entirely different direction. She's a Berlin-based artist who often deals with sort of stereotypes, often read through cultural icons, particularly music, rock and roll, things like that, but stereotypes of gender and how that's employed in language and positioned as both gendered and power-based, without actual representation, and how those things actually are communicated. So this is actually there are 10 of a series of 63 ink drawings that were called Kill Your Father, which are all kind of like deconstructed quotations primarily from iconic male rock songs, as well as like images that were lifted from album covers and other kinds of characteristic male, particularly imagery, that she then represented. And the unfortunate part is this book is black and white, and some of the power of the images is lost, I must admit, because the red is so, the red tone that she chooses is so kind of half like menstrual and half girly, and it's really kind of, it has a nice tension that it creates between those types of things. So you see, I mean, you'll get the sense from these as you read them, and again, using this very ostensibly neutral typography that was a really popular font for punk bands, for example. A lot of sort of aggressive kind of approaches, again, typically typed as male within that genre. So I'm going to show them to you. I like that one in particular. The chain imagery is a recurrent one. She uses it both literally, like as objects in the work, quite a bit, to construct kind of conflicting, like hammocks, for example, out of chains, or things that are implied as comforting or nestling or female, then using this kind of material that reads, of course, again as the opposite. And so then the image of it, typically knotted and typically confounded upon itself, tends to recur within the drawings as well. So he does. That's my favorite. Okay, and Sue De Beer, American artist, also living in Berlin, actually. And what these are a series of Polaroid, not quite outtakes, but sort of set photography that she does that is part of her practice, ongoing practice, while she's filming the video installations that are her primary form of work. A lot of her work, I'm going to just mention this in case this seems a little gnarly when you look at it, a lot of her work does kind of delve into tropes of violence and horror in particular, and a kind of the artificiality of horror movies, or sort of Hollywood presentations of these very embedded, kind of intense and, again, usually aggressive, violent moments, usually trying to trouble the kind of immersion or kind of complete, again, direct translation that those movies and those types of narratives are after and images are after, by inserting small, almost sometimes very patent and sometimes more difficult to assess kind of cues to them being false. So in any case, this is from the last film that she did that was called Black Sun, and was about sort of various stages, often again of a female character moving through various stages of her life. And this is the vestige of a scene that was actually cut, wherein the protagonist was violently attacked, as you see, in a significant arena of her female anatomy, and is posing as a kind of like cheesecake shot in the set itself. So that isn't actually supposed to be the reason there's no explanation to hers. Hers is just a pure set of images. Is really about kind of troubling the readability of violence to some degree, and how we've become accustomed to understanding certain kinds of images as conveying a narrative that we're not always aware is being communicated to us. And by repeating this over and over again, in sort of some slightly more expected and some kind of, again, like particularly the smiling one below, which I find somewhat disturbing. But in any case, some of these sort of standard poses and then conflating them with unusual formats. The bed is like, you can not read it as well here, but in the book you can see it's super, super girly. It's like satin and curly Q text and pictures of bunnies and things like that in the background. And, again, just trying to bring out some of those seemingly seamless communications or definitions within that. Shannon Ebner is a LA-based photographer, and much of what she is working with is an idea of the readable subject, and what that means in terms of translating your whatever individual identity or some kind of communication of meaning through an image that either literally reads, she uses text a lot, or is implied to read, and obliterating what that is. I'm going to give you the image to look at. They're very often sort of performances or sculptural interventions into landscapes, whether urban or natural, that then only exist as the documentation of the image. And in this case, you can probably only just barely decipher. I just can see, you see right away is her, that's her holding up the sign, so to speak, that is kind of obliterating her as the subject, if that makes sense. And so she has actually had a quote from a Susan Sontag text called The Aesthetics of Silence, which to my mind resonates with the kind of tone that she's after, in a way trying to tamp down the excessive over-explaining of everything, or excessive readability, the notion of an image being an immediate all-at-once kind of communication, what advertising is based on, basically, and what most of the imagery that we encounter in the world is based on. And by sort of eviscerating it of that possibility, then creating kind of a space of what she calls a space of silence, wherein you have to determine your own. So the Sontag text, again, highly recommended. It's a wonderful text called The Aesthetics of Silence. The element that I pulled reads, exactly what a totality is, what constitutes completeness in art or anything else, is precisely the problem. That problem is, in principle, an unresolvable one. The fact is that whatever way a work of art is, it could have been or could be different. The necessity of these parts in this order is never a given state, it is conferred. The refusal to admit this essential contingency or openness is what inspires the audience's will to confirm the closedness of a work of art by interpreting it, and what creates the feeling common among reflective artists and critics that the artwork is always somehow in arrears of or inadequate to its subject. And I mean, essentially that whole paragraph is really what this whole project is about, and this kind of positioning the whole project, but also I think the individual projects themselves, these artists' work, positioning against a notion of the autonomy of the object, that something can have a kind of timeless read, and that it is always, and in fact, not just always as a result of the approach, open, or it has that point of relay that I mentioned before, but actually that's what its function is to do. And it was a pretty major revision of thinking that has happened over time since sort of the 50s, and kind of a modernist extension beyond. Some of you might be familiar with the sort of positioning of Clement Greenberg or Michael Fried, wherein that idea of the pure state of art is its very timelessness, i.e. static definition or one-to-one readability. Sort of, that might be it. Are you all familiar with Clement Greenberg, Michael Fried? That's kind of a critical area to that. Maybe some of you. I'm checking to see who's nodding and who isn't. In any case, it's the notion of sort of that formalist position that has since been revised into a much broader and more inflected way, but it is typically presented as, each genre of artwork should do no more than define its own limits, and requires a purity of presence, is the way that it was always put. And it's interestingly couched in a very moral language, and that this notion primarily is read through the critique of the minimalist object, the specific object that was corrupt, was actually the word I think he used, because it invited and actually required the sort of participation or activation of the audience moving around and through it. In other words, the idea of time and a temporal relationship and contextual relativity, and that was in fact the very thing that slippage between genre, between audience, and between object was this sort of sin of new art. And it's really very much written with that kind of tone. Again, also a really seminal text worth reading to think about some of these things. In any case, Susan Sontag has long been someone who has defined art in an oppositional way to that, again, as a point of relay, as a notion of openness, and essential contingency, which I think is a great way to phrase it. Anyway, this is Shannon's project, this kind of wonderful, spare and empty images where the subject is the non-subject. I am going to skip over this artist because he is a writer, and so you really would just need to read the text to have any sense of it, but it's, as you can see, dedicated to this idea of absence as well, and that notion of silence and impossibility in trying to communicate in a very direct textual way. I would read it to you, but you're tired of me reading by now. Okay, Joshua Ocon is a Mexico City-based artist, and what he did for this project was to take a set of drawings from, I'm trying to think of what they're called. They're basically comic books, very popular comic books in Mexico City, and he translated the text in Spanish through a computer translator into English, and then he used those texts to draw the drawings that they then conveyed. So it actually ends up being essentially nonsensical translation. So has anyone ever used one of those computer programs? I mean, it's really kind of an extraordinary. There's a couple of, oddly enough, I can think of 4 other artist projects that were employing the same practice. Again, it's such a perfect capture of this idea of the impossibility of translation, the way it generates new meaning and often contradictory or oppositional meaning to what it is. So, darn it, you really can't read it, can you? In any case, you can see from sort of the lack of readability of the image itself that, here, I'll give you another one, of what's actually going on there. Typically, the comic book format is primarily designed for as immediate a visual read as you can in relationship to very minimal text. And frankly, to my mind, when done well, is one of the most beautiful ways of putting concurrence of those two types of things, because it's the necessity of the spareness to a comic book image and text is really amazing, and how it communicated density of information. In any case, this is kind of playing off sort of the opposite, kind of presenting itself in an opposite way, even while using that same format. The text it doesn't say much, because the narrative actually doesn't make any sense whatsoever, which is, again, part of the point. And this is also mimicking, those of you who haven't seen those particular types of comics, mimicking the way they're laid out on the page with these kind of dramatic absences or voids within them to make the visual more emphatic. I think you can read a couple of them, right? That one's a good one. Hey, why devils do not come you? Anyhow, so it's his series of pages to read through. And you get kind of invested in structure, because what it does is actually draw out how intensely committed we all are to constructing these stories. And I mean that not in a critical way. I mean, it's the way that we structure our own lives in terms of telling ourselves stories about who we were, who we are, what we will be, all of those things, making sense of the world via telling stories, given the materials that we have. But it's really fascinating how hard you try to make this into a story, and that it's relatively successful in certain cases, even though your story, because of its nonsensical nature, will be entirely different than somebody else's. Okay, all the way through. Really beautiful drawings as well. They're all done by hand. And do I have to? Yeah, okay. Javier Tellez, the visual is not going to convey, but it's just as interesting. The project makes a lot of sense. Again, it's called Artaud Remix, and it basically presents the complete glossolalia writings of Antonin Artaud, a French playwright and poet. And it's kind of an unbelievable labor of what he did here, because he basically went through the 26-volume edition of Artaud's writings and pulled all the glossolalia out of it, which is basically like Babel, basically speaking in tongues is what that actually means, and then strung it into a kind of narrative across that time and space and internal world of all of those writings in its direct way. And that 26-volume set has also never been translated in full, and so this is kind of his summary homage to its lack of translatability. So this is not meaningful unless you can read some of it, but just so you get a sense of it. And he managed to get all 26 volumes into these 10 pages, which is kind of impressive. Not to mention trying to pull them out. So it's kind of inherent in the repetitive density of that it is, kind of, again, this labor of extraction as well. Okay, and that's him, Artaud, I mean. Mungo Thomson's this is a selection from a project that he had done called, I think it's called New York Film Sets or New York Scenes, something to that effect. And basically what it is he photographed sets, New York City film sets in California, like on movie sets, and strung them together without any identifying things that would definitively signify that it was false, but there's always something that's not quite right, like being able to see, I want to find the golf cart one because it's the most obvious. There's like small elements that clearly aren't part of that scene or so on. But what was interesting about it is how, again, how much we strive to see the construction of reality as a mirror, or the image of reality as a mirror of reality, and how few people actually did notice the interruptions, I guess is a way to put it, that existed on these simulacra of the city. And they're easier to see, of course, when you're looking at it a little more clearly than you are here. And this actually, Mungo got the Borges quote in Self, which was from a text called Mirrors, which now I think I have lost. Oh, here it is. And it's my favorite poem of his, and it's very much about the idea of mirrors being an incomplete reflection of reality, or just the notion of mirroring, again, translating things from one context to another that automatically lies. That's what he always called it, that mirrors were inherently terrifying because they were deceitful in that way of that falsity, essentially. And the quote for him is, again from that poem, "It is strange to dream and to have mirrors where the commonplace, worn-out repertory of every day may include the illusory, profound globe that reflections scheme. God, I keep thinking, has taken pains to design that ungraspable architecture, reared by every dawn from the gleam of a mirror, by darkness from a dream." And anyway, seem to relate to a degree. Okay, the last project, I'm just going to, they read also, by the way, as you read through the book, it's done as a film strip, as you probably all surmised from that. Lastly, Andrea Zattel. This is excerpts, again, from a project that was all based on this idea of translation of experience, translation of, structural day-to-day living. Much, as some of you might know, much of her work deals with kind of trying to unpack the structure, which she calls the structures of living, by which we all function, and which ones are questionable, and just to think about how those things structure our lives, and what are the ways in which they are truly functional, the ways in which they're oppressive, and so on and so forth. And as part of this larger project, she lived. It's a chronological drawing in 26 parts, although we couldn't put all of it in there, called Free-Running Patterns and Rhythms in an Isolated Human Subject. And it's a week she lived without time in a basement in Berlin. And basically, blocked out all sources of natural light, sound, clocks, etc., and then tried to map that experience for the viewer later. And essentially, this whole print project is about the impossibility of trying to convey that experience without the structures by which we normally exchange those formats. So we tried to replay that as a kind of density of time, of the moments. And she inserts her speculations on ostensibly what was happening at the same time, which she had no idea of, each of those days, along with some of these other image communications. So, anyhow. Okay, so that's the book. That's the format of the book, and what to my mind, was really a way to pull together a variety of different ways of thinking about this idea of translatability or mutability in the world. As you can see, the range of artists and the approaches and the types of content is very broad, and that again was intentional. With the idea that there'd be a node running through it that made some sense, but that wasn't necessarily part of the point, being that it can't be manifest in the same way or in any kind of repetitively recognizable way. Can we lights now, so I'm not talking to the dark? So that's really what I wanted to put out there, as positing a kind of set of ideas and some examples of what I was thinking about.